This morning we have a keynote from Thomas Popkewitz. Now, Thomas Popkewitz is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His studies are concerned with the political and cultural politics of education, knowledge, and its comparative reason. These studies view schooling and research as practices creating kinds of people that distribute differences to exclude and abject. His recent studies focus on the impracticality of present practical research for enacting its social commitments, examining historically current curriculum teacher education and international assessments as generating phantasmograms that affectively differentiate potentialities about societies and people. So, it is my great honor to be able to introduce our keynote, which today is titled The Practices and Paradoxes of Educational Research, Magic Lanterns and Equitable Futures That Exclude. Let's please welcome Thomas Popkewitz.
I was thinking this morning, years ago, I did a study around the US of urban and rural schools. And then when I wrote the book about the study, the copy editor, who was more than a copy editor, at Teachers College Press, wrote back and said, "This is a book about philosophy." And I got angry. Because the book was an empirical study. And it wasn't that I was disturbed about the philosophical sort of ways I brought in analysis, but I was annoyed and angry about the way in which the notion of empirical becomes colonialized. So my claim is, I don't know what I am intellectually, but I enjoy and find very helpful reading philosophy, so I appreciate very much being invited here. My background is not philosophy, but on the other hand, it has to be. Because I'll give you another short story. I went to a liberal arts school in New York, which is where I grew up. And in that school, you couldn't major in education because it was considered a professional program, and it was a liberal arts school, and therefore you could minor in it. And so I took a lot of liberal arts courses in all sorts of, in the humanities mostly, very little in the social sciences. Psychology was probably the only one I took. And to give you my bias, when I finished that, I had to declare a major, and I said, if I do this psychology for the rest of my life, I'll turn crazy. You're always reflecting about yourself in a way, it's debilitating. On the other hand, I married a psychologist. And when I started doing my graduate work, I realized how much of education takes for granted all of that liberal arts. And because they have educational literature, at least in the ones I read, take for granted a lot of the historical work related to the liberal arts, whether it's from John Locke or even American progressivism. They tend to lose sight of American progressivism as part of, first of all, a more general worldwide movement of modernizing and scientificizing the school. But also lose sight of how, for example, American progressivism was the formation of the modern welfare state in the US. And to understand the modern school, you have to understand that location. It's just not the school and the sort of folk heroes that is written up. So anyway, that's my caveats, and I hope when I'm done, you still appreciate my being here. All right. The work I'm going to talk about today is going to be both specific and general. I'm looking at the screen, I might as well. I'm going to talk about PESA, but my interest in PESA, the OECD program, is not only with PESA. I'm interested in the way in which social science becomes an actor in society. And I'm not talking about the people who do research, I'm talking about the way in which the particular knowledge that is constructed through particular kinds of science. I've written about it, I call it the practical sciences. You can call it utilitarian, the sciences that try to be normative and tell you how to do things. And I'm trying to understand how that becomes an actor, but in it, I'll draw upon, we were just talking about Jacques Rancière, how you try to deal with inequities, you try to deal with exclusions to make an inclusive world, but the very way you do it is you reinscribe the inequities as the way of thinking about equality. And so I'm going to talk about the sciences, those sciences, through PESA. So there's two levels of but the concrete part will be with PESA because that's my empirical object. And I do mean it as an empirical object versus the positivist notion of it, or the Cartesian notion of empirical. There's my philosophy. You just got all of it at once. Okay. And I started this with thinking about, at least in the US, and maybe here too, I don't know. The folk wisdom is that of researchers, and it's backed up by research because they do research to say teachers don't use research, is that teachers don't use it. But I want to argue that research matters. And why does it matter? It's not how you think it matters, because it matters as part of the cultural politics of knowledge in modernity. And I'm going to argue through PESA that science generates patterns of recognition and expectations of experience. And in that way, it acts on us. And there's a very good, one of my folk heroes in philosophy is Ian Hacking. And if you haven't read his work, it's really very, very interesting in talking about the limitations and understanding of how science functions in modernity. He's not talking about only social science. Okay, and in that, I want to argue, and we take this for granted, which is always interesting to me. We take for granted the comparative notion of science. PESA is a perfect example. Very rarely do I find anybody ever writing about its notion of comparison. They assume it's comparing nations, but in fact, it's comparing people. And also it's different notions of comparison within PESA itself, but it's also within, in the book I wrote on the impracticality, I'm not selling it by the way, the impracticality of practical research, I also wrote about teacher education research. So, and I talked about how they look different, but historically and epistemologically, they're really not. Okay, so I'm going to say the calculations, and this is where the notion of phantasmagram comes in. I'm trying to think about time too. And I'm drawing upon an art historian named Jill Cassid, who wrote a book about this, about the 17th century, not about what I'm talking about. But she talks about how modern science is built upon the early projection machines, what we'll call magic lanterns. And I want to argue what the sciences that we use in education generally, I'm not talking about anybody I know here, are like the magic lanterns. They're projections of images and narratives of people that are illusions. But those illusions are both of hope, but also, they're also dangerous. And it's those two things I want to deal with, which I call double gestures. There's a whole background to what I'm going to say, which I'm not going to talk about, which is what I call continental philosophy. And you'll hear it in the way I express some things, but I won't talk about Foucault, and I won't talk about Deleuze, and I won't talk about Rancière. And I won't talk about hacking, a little bit maybe, once in a while. All right, so this is the magic lantern that I'm talking about, but if you think about what science does, it is like a magic lantern. It projects images of children, teachers, communities, and so on, and we take them as real. And I want to argue how that is produced, but also the dangers of that production. All right. These are kinds of people get produced in and through research. Although it's not only research, that becomes more complicated to talk about how the very categories and distinctions we use in research are also social ones. But here I just listed a few. When we talk about the professional teacher, the well-being and literate student, and the other child who lacks motivation and engagement. That is how you produce the other in trying to produce the sense of self. Okay. What do I mean by patterns of recognition and expectations and experience? Throughout, I'm going to continue to come back to this to say that you're learning how to see. There's a wonderful article by Lorraine Daston, who's a historian of science, who talks about the invention of observation for science. How you begin to learn how to see in a way that you discipline and organize and also begin to fragment the things you see, versus in the 16th century, if you went into a place and you took notes, they were random notes, had nothing to do with any kind of discipline. And the example I'm going to use is Euclidean geometry. Almost every school in the world today, that as far as my math education friends tell me, teach Euclidean geometry. And this is from some work of Melissa Andretti Molina in Chile, where she said, and she was looking at the Chilean education, where they're teaching kids how to learn Euclidean geometry. Euclidean geometry is built upon a Euclidean space, which is flat and two-dimensional, and also Galilean objects, which are fixed. It's like a roadmap. When you look at your GPS on your phone, that's Euclidean geometry. And it's filled with Cartesian logic and so on, and this is what kids are learning. And what she's learning is, what they're learning in school, she argues, is how not to see. And she calls it a sightless sight. Because if you think about the world we live in, just try to cross the street. To me, the example is I sail. And if I use Euclidean geometry to sail, my sailboat would be up on the rocks. Because the whole complexity of trying to figure out where the wind is, where the water is, and so on, is much more complex than any kind of Euclidean geometry. And also, there are multiple other kinds of geometry that could get into the school, but they don't. You have to ask this question, why? And it seems to me that in a way, we have to think about science that way. That is, it's a way of organizing what we see, how we organize it. That's not necessarily bad, but here's my Foucault. It is all potentially dangerous. And so we need to continually ask, what's the sight we're being given? Okay, so now I want to turn to PESA and how it makes sight. And in that, when I say makes it, it produces the phenomena that we see. And we take it as real. And there's a whole literature in the history and sociology of science which deals with this, but not with PESA. Or it deals with somewhat. One of the people is Ted Porter at UCLA, who writes about statistics and numbers, if you're interested. Okay. And I'm going to talk about it as an effective economy. By effective economy, what do I mean? It generates a will to know. And that will is a feeling and emotional attachment to the knowledge that suggests and compares and differentiates kinds of people. That's my interest in how PESA does that. And on the right, on my right, I don't know what it is, probably on your right too, is Deleuze's notion of rhizome and my notion of cake, and they're very similar. What PESA is like a cake. If you bake a cake, you have a lot of different ingredients, you put it in, you mix it up, you pull it out of the oven, you don't see the ingredients anymore. That's PESA. What you see is a calculation. And it says our children in this country doing that versus that country. And you don't see all the different ingredients that went into it. What I want to do today is explore somewhat some of those ingredients, but understand those ingredients as a way of comparing. And that comparing isn't just about numbers, it's about people, the kind of people that distributes differences. And what's very interesting and important for me in that is that the distribution of difference is spoken about as a way of creating equality. But in fact, it's producing inequality. Not because the people in PESA are bad people, but the very way in which that knowledge gets organized historically does that. Okay. We had Thanksgiving and I had all my kids together, and this is what they gave me, a cough. All right. When you look at PESA, you see this chart. It looks like the cake. Okay, you can find probably Australia on there. I can find the US and get embarrassed by it, and a lot of other countries as well. But when you look at this, you realize there are a lot of different things that enter into it to make it into an object that becomes a calculation. You begin to see things and think about what you do with those things. You have to have that other part to remember. It isn't only about describing, it also is about, in that description, a way of thinking about the potentialities that you want to create. It's not just about the present. And I'll get more into that. Okay? So this is the cake. And then if you look at it historically, and a friend of mine from Melbourne, Julie McLeod, was very helpful in suggesting some stuff to help me deal with this, which is this part here, which I hadn't realized. After 1950s, a new model of social science begins to emerge. And when I say maybe not emerge is the right word, it becomes visible because things were happening much before and then also at the same time. Some of them I'll talk about right now. One of them is you can begin to see social institutions as populations and experimental sites that are laboratories. In my university, they called it R&D, research and development. Basically what you do research, you figure out how you do that research, so then when you do that research, you can treat the people in that place, you don't call them that, you call it schools, as laboratories to try to change. And this becomes a very important part of modern social science. It's also part of Amazon, which is the use of big data. But you begin to do that. Before that, most people did research in schools by not going to schools. All right? I mean, when I first came to Madison, which is after this, people in other fields would come and ask me for lunch, and I felt honored, and then I realized why, because the schools were very quick to get, the school researchers, which were being mobilized at that time, were very quick to go into schools. And they wanted to learn because social work and all the other fields wanted to go into their places and learn how to do that kind of research, whether it was qualitative or quantitative. Didn't make a difference. So that's one part of this cake or this rhizome. And then you have mass observations, and then you have all this data, mass data. Today we call it big data. But with that, you also have the beginning and use of Bayesian statistics, which is a way of thinking about probability, but also thinking about it in terms of continual reorganizing it in creation of new data points, which is different than earlier statistics. I can go into that if you want. Not too much, though. And then you also have the emergence, and I'll talk a little bit about more of this, certain kinds of social theories, particularly cybernetics and systems theory. So all these things get mixed together in PESA. The other is, and I'll talk about what I think about as the alchemy, that is what we think about as the teaching of science and mathematics in schools. I can talk about art, I can talk about music if you want. I'll try to focus here because PESA focuses more on math and science. These become storage spaces and memories. It sounds funny, but they do. Because when you start talking about schools and you're using PESA, these become the places where you start. You don't say, oh, back in the progressive era, it was like this. You say, okay, this country, the kids are scoring this on this score. How do we get them to move to another place so they move up or down on the scale? And PESA is very good at that because they have all these things about how you improve, or nations that have been most improving, or how do you stay on top. These are titles of actual reports that they do. So you can see in all of this, this is not about the present, it's about the future. So whatever they're doing is not in an image of saying I'm describing, it's an image of some utopic notion of what potentialities should be, that if you follow the models of PESA, and it's not only PESA, by the way, that somehow you can actualize that future through some sort of intervention. In this sense, these things come together as a way of seeing. You see the child, you see the teacher, you see the school, you see communities, and so on. These are being produced by the very measurements you're using. And that's important. And again, science does that. So this isn't a critique of science in general. It's a way of trying to understand a very particular kind of science that's operating in modern societies. And I can talk about why I'm using the word modern, but also very particularly as it relates to current international forums that try to say how you improve schools. Okay, this is from PESA. Now, I said earlier, it's about an anticipated future. And for the last, 4 years, 5 years, I've been working with a group in Sweden looking at PESA. They've been looking more in terms of how PESA influences Swedish policy and social media, public opinion. And mine has been more this kind of stuff. And we get along very well. And it's been before that, I'd never even thought about PESA, because in the US, you only hear it indirectly, which is also interesting. But if you look at this, you realize this is not, PESA is saying that they have some notion of what the future should be. And this is the idea of digital revolution today versus the industrial revolution. And they talk about how this relates to a future economy, technology, prosperity through education. But it's not, what they're talking about is not an empirical fact in the sense that they just somehow are describing what the world is about. They're empirical facts built upon imagined utopic images of what that world should be. There's a very good article, a chapter in a book by Mary Poovey on the invention of the modern fact, where she talks about Adam Smith and markets, which is a very common sort of interest today about neoliberalism and so on. And it's very interesting to read how Adam Smith used statistics and empirical evidence to try to flush out the philosophical ideals that were embodied in the idea of wealth of nations. And so we're not talking about describing what is, we're talking about using philosophical ideals as ways of collecting information and data that make those and flush out those philosophical ideas. And that's what PESA does. Not intentionally, but it's built into the way in which it thinks. The other is it's also considered to be democratic. And this is, again, for me, part of its affect. The affect meaning, how does it become appealing to people all over the world with different cultures, different histories, and so on? Because it gives a sense of, first of all, internally, they talk about empowerment, they talk about bottoms-up approach. These are languages you're probably very familiar with. But they also talk about how nations can catch up who are behind and how nations who are ahead can stay ahead. And so in a sense, everyone gets something out of it. But the thing in it, and this is the thing that I'll continually also come back to, they're double gestures. Because in the desire for this utopic world about what the world should be and people should be, is also what's dystopic. And I'll get to that in a minute. That is what is dangerous and therefore should be either excluded or objective. So the very acts of inclusion are also acts of exclusion. And again, I'm talking about the way the knowledge constructs what you see and how you see. Okay. One of the central things of PESA is this idea of literacy, which is a very appealing idea. It's very much, in back of that, by the way, if you want to think about it, it comes out of the Enlightenment and the idea of how you have a good life. And the idea of literacy is how you can create a self, because literacy is about the creation of a self, that can somehow have access to that good life. And so PESA pulls upon that, and that's why I'm calling it part of its affect. But it also, another part of its affect is a very particular part of modernity, which I'm pulling on different people here in a way and thinking about how that knowledge, that is how I can come here and talk to you about PESA in a way that looks like I'm talking about a generalized, non-polemic language that looks like it has no home because it travels. It can go from here, it can go to Mexico, it can go to the US, and in every place we can talk about it as though it fits. And that's an element, Bruno Latour writes about it, and I think he calls it immovable mobiles, things that can move back and forth. Okay, so if you look at these charts can be read anywhere. And they look like they have no location. They look like they're, and I like the word homeless, because it looks like it has no home, but you can give it a home, which is also part of its beauty, at least its elegance. And that has importance in science. And again, I'm not denying that. And I gave some examples of these kinds of words that we use that are homeless. Society, participation, competence, benchmarks. These are all homeless concepts. You can use them any way you want, and then think that they're relevant to you. Okay. All right. Now I want to call this a phantasmagram. Why? Because this is from PESA, and it's talking about children learning mathematics, literacy in mathematics. If you look at it, think about it, and it's really interesting. You really have to sort of challenge the way you normally think of things, at least I do. Because normally I would look at this and say, okay, this is what literacy means in mathematics. How do I get kids to do it? But if you look at it a little bit harder, you realize it has nothing to do with mathematics. It actually has to do with systems theory. And it's a systems theory way of trying to organize and create analytical categories that you can somehow add up together, and that creates a sense of what it means to be mathematically literate. Now, if any of you know a real mathematician, I mean someone who practices it as sort of in the universities you work in, you'll realize that no one thinks or works like this. This is a creation of PESA. It's a phantasmagram. It's an illusion. But the illusion is not just there as an illusion, because it actually works on us. Because as you see, and you probably know, people try to say, how do I get kids to do this? And you organize curriculum and things to do that. The other thing in it is, and both of them I'll talk more about the alchemy. It's built upon a particular kind of way that science and math, but I also can say art, I could say music, I could say physical education, get translated into the school. When I say that, you have to think about the kids there. They're not like a physicist. If I go to the building in my department where the physicists are, they live a particular kind of life. That life is somehow transformed into the School of Education and put into something else. And I want to talk about that. So this infrastructure of PESA is built upon all these different things that get put together like you mix a cake. And they come out and you say, oh, how did this kid score? And did they score well? And if they scored well, they're literate. But the literacy is built upon a different notion of literacy that has nothing to do with science and math. And there's a tremendous amount of historical work related to the schools, a lot of it done in Australia, but also done in Europe and also the US, which continually talk, and that's what I'm going now, talk about how this translation works, what I call the alchemy. The alchemists were people the European alchemists, were people in I think it was in the 16th century, who tried to turn metals into gold as a way of finding the magic elixir to find what was called the philosopher's stone. And the philosopher's stone was to find the ultimate truth that God gave to the world. And the modern curriculum is that. I keep citing books, but because I like books. There's a book by someone named Carl Becker, who's a historian, who wrote in 1932. That's before me. And he talked about the heavenly city of, I can't remember the title, but it basically talks about how you take this notion of God and theology and you transform it into a secular notion in the Enlightenment. And so the philosopher's stone still exists, but we use secular terms today. All right, so here's my analogy of the alchemy. You start with something like computer science. You go in the building, take a lot of pictures. This is the educator, but it's not only the educator. Sometimes it's John Dewey, when he wrote about scientific method, also wrote about an idealized notion of scientific method. He had no inclination about what scientists did and didn't care. They take all these things that are going on in the lab, they pick out what's important to them as they relate to children. It gets on a train that has to travel. In my campus, you have to go across a few streets. And it gets into the education building. It gets put into a language of classroom management, how do you, objective competencies, benchmarks, you name it. It's a whole different way of thinking. And so what happens when it gets into the school, it's a whole different way of thinking that has nothing to do with science and math, and that's what I'm going to get to. And then when you look at PESA, PESA takes this notion of what science and math is that goes into the school and says we're going to test kids on that. So you have this whole transformation going on, but still the image is they're learning science and math. My simple way of saying is educators, people in curriculum fields, my department, go into a zoology building, they take a lot of photographs, they take it back to the School of Education, and they say, how do we organize these photographs into what children learn? It has nothing to do with physics. And it's easy to sort of understand that. Let me use music because, and then I'll go to science and math. This is in the 1920s. Well, actually, music came into the American schools. I'm checking my time. In Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, you had a lot of Irish who immigrated to the US into the Boston area. If you know about Boston, Boston actually is a small city, and you know why it's small? Because the Protestant people who organized the political apparatus of Massachusetts wanted to contain the immigrant populations. This was not only in Boston, it was in a lot of other places. And so that's why Boston is surrounded by like Concord and Lexington, Bedford, and you name them. But they're not part of Boston. One of the problems they had in Boston was tuberculosis. This was a very common disease at the turn of the century. And one of the things they thought about tuberculosis, it had to do with people breathing. They didn't breathe the air properly. And so someone named Horace Mann decided he would go to Prussia. They had music education there, and went there and said, we'll bring back music education to schools, to the Boston schools, because it'll be good for the Irish girls. I don't know why he separated out the boys from the girls, but he did. And he brought back choral music. That's how music got into the school. To have the girls sing so that they can clean their lungs and be healthy. It had nothing to do with music. Later on, they brought music appreciation. And then it becomes scientized. And this is one of the persons, his name is Carl Seashore, who was at the University of Iowa, developed a test for music ability. This is around 1920s. And this is from his textbook, and this is an illustration of how this has nothing to do with music. In these photographs, and you're going to have to be very, very discriminating, so look very, very closely, because I couldn't do it. You have same group of, remember, they didn't go into schools, but they were trying to understand from his college students how different kinds of music reacted on different pupils. So in one of these photographs, they're playing classical music, and the other, they're playing jazz. Why jazz? Why classical? Classical is a European music. And in one of these photographs, the kids look happy, engaged, they're being stimulated. And the others, they're listening to jazz, and it looks like they're being mentally disturbed. That's his conclusion. And so you could realize that these subjects, which have the names of these disciplines outside, this is where Deleuze's notion of rhizome is very interesting, because they still have the name, they're playing an instrument, they're listening to music, but the whole assembly and connection of things is something else. Okay, let's go to math education. I mean, I could give you a whole series just on this alchemy, because there's so much work that's done on it. And even today, and I'll give you one from today in science, But let's look at mathematics. This is for a doctor. This was a doctoral dissertation, and she wrote it as a book of Jenny Diaz. And she looked at what are the images and what are the narratives of children in different periods of math education from post-war to the present. And then she looked at the present and she said, if you want to think in this is elementary or primary school, what are the characteristics of the child who learns mathematics? And this is what she came out of looking at it and saying analytically, what are these characteristics? Look at these characteristics. Rational, intelligent, logical, creative, I read very well. Intelligent, self-sufficient, abstract, responsible, free-thinking, innovative. What does this have to do with mathematics? It has to do with the idealized notion of an American citizen. But also in these characteristics, you also have to think what's absent. That is, in these notions of rational is also, without speaking it, a notion of what's irrational. What's intelligent is also a notion of what's not intelligent. I mentioned earlier the book, The Struggling for the Soul. One of the things teachers did in urban schools and also rural schools, but more urban, is very often say, these kids are really bright and smart, but they have streetwise intelligence, as a way of differentiating them from some ideal notion of intelligence. Now, the teacher was trying to honor the kids. She was trying to help the kids. But the very language itself produced its other. And all of these have its other. And that's how, in a way, even though we often and try very much to think about inclusion, we need to also think about how we create the categories and distinctions that make up that inclusion, and also what it's excluding. And I'll get more into that in a minute. By the way, one of the things Jenny started with these equal signs, because the equal sign you think of as a sign of pure mathematics, but it also is a very powerful political symbol, and how that gets written into the curriculum in ways that we need to pay attention to. Okay, let's go to science literacy. And again, I'm giving you a travelogue now, but the point is to try to think about how we practice and think about science in ways that's just not science. And again, I'm into these double gestures. And by double gestures, I mean, and this is also from reading different texts in psychology, particularly, but not only psychology, also curriculum. Whenever you read a text in education, I find, but it's not only in education, it's part of a sort of a cultural narrative, you have a double, and this goes back, by the way, to the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment was built upon not only the idea that you create enlightened people, but also fear of degeneration and decay. And they coincided. And so it's not a new phenomenon, although it takes on new forms in different times. So when I say hopes, I read a text on middle school adolescence. It talks about why you have to help the adolescent become a good adult and so on. That's the hope. But next to that is the fear about the adolescent in being a delinquent, having too much sexuality, teenage pregnancy, the whole range of things. And they're always together. They're not really in opposition. It's part of the same phenomena. Okay, let's go to science. Another doctoral student, Lei Zheng, did a study of the emergence of STEM, which is very popular today. STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And one of the things that she traced back to the Club of Rome and also to OECD, and among others, is that what you begin to do is take systems thought as a way of trying to think, how do you take these diverse sciences? If anybody here knows anything about science, you know they have different epistemic machineries. Biology is not the same thing as astronomy, not the same thing as physics. But what STEM does is put them all together into the same thing, and PESA does that, by the way. You have to look at how they create items. And what she also, in trying to create this unified notion by which to think of different sciences, you also have in it a unified vision of the future. And part of it, she argues how that comes out historically in the 50s and 60s through these different agencies and how it travels in different places, so you can't locate it in a particular nation. It moves. Another part of this notion of science is work done in a school called neo-institutionalism. And one of the studies by someone named Eleanor McNeary looked at scientific literacy in 16 different countries. And she took textbooks of high school science where they talk about scientific literacy. The assumption would be that scientific literacy is a singular thing. Science is science. But when she looked at the textbook, she realized that the notion of scientific literacy had no single notion. It varied by nations, and it varied by the way in which science was organized as a way of developing a sense of national identity. So there isn't no single notion of science. Now, here's the double gestures. It comes in, and this is a study in Sweden by Malin Eidelin. And what she did was ethnographies of Swedish schools. Swedes have a moral sense of the world about, in general, they have, and they also have a very strong sense of environment. But the thing is that when you look at these words, you realize they take on particular characteristics in different places. So what she did was, this is a notion of a sustainable world. You have windmills generating, you ride your bicycle, you have a really very strong notion of nature, but it's a very Lutheran notion of nature. I mean, again, you have to historically begin to understand how these different notions of nature. I was just talking about to someone about the creation of national parks in the US at the turn of the century. They come out of religious notions that get incorporated into social life and how you see nature. So anyway, this is the Swedish notion of nature. And it's very, very strong. One time I was walking in a forest in southern Sweden with a friend of mine, and a group of women, they were immigrants from Turkey. And they were Swedish. And they were just having 4 or 5 women. They were having a wonderful time laughing and so on. And one of the women with me said, "How un-Swedish." Because if you go into the nature, you're quiet, you're soft, right? And so you can see how these things are not just there as things to learn, they carry with it all sorts of notions about what's virtue and what's not virtue. But in this study, she also began to say there are things that are not there that become there. That when the Swedish kids looked at kids particularly in Cape Town and also in China, they had a different notion of what is sustainable. And for them, that notion of sustainable living was different from the Swedish. And therefore, they thought they were not living a good life. Because to live the Swedish notion of the good life, you have to have a lot of money. And we all live with it. I mean, so our notion, the idea of even, I have in my house every Monday, the truck comes for the recyclables. You have to be able to afford that. And so not everybody, but the point here is that even though you recognize that, when you see others doing it, you consider they're others. And that's important to understand. Okay, so all of these things enter into PESA. The alchemy, the cybernetics, the whole notion of mass observations and so on become brought together in this notion of literacy, and literacy becomes a way in which you begin to create an image and a narrative about who the child should be. That's the phantagma. It's a projection. It's a projection that has to do with not anything real, but with some utopic images that are built into the way in which the knowledge gets formed. And again, I'm not blaming this on the people who do PESA, but I'm talking about a particular way in which a particular kind of science gets constructed that we think is about school improvement. Okay. You can see here how it gets constructed as an image, illusory image that is made real. And I'll just tell you what's on the right, and then you can go to the PESA documents and you can see this. What they're saying is you take this model and you give it to kids and you ask them questions to see how they use this in their daily life. So it's not just something about how do we think about whether they're literate? We also want them to be able to use this as a way of thinking about their modes of living. And so the phantasmagram is, this becomes real. And we operate it on real. And I can give you dozens of other examples outside of PESA. You could probably do it yourself. But it's not only about literacy, because the literacy is tied to a notion of well-being. It says people who do well and are literate are also people who are motivated, who participate. And those words sound like the universal sort of this, what I talked about before, this non-polemic language. But they're very particular. The notion of satisfaction, the notion of engagement, the notion of motivation has a very particular Western history to it. Actually another former graduate student, but who's working at Madison, has been working on the notion of grit, which is now coming up also in the PESA stuff. These are not words that they look like they have no location, but they're very historically located with particular values and notions about how you should live your life. Okay, I'm going to finish. You should have clapped for that. What seems global and locationless has locations. And it brings into focus, I didn't talk much about this, but you can easily begin to think about issues of colonialization. You also can begin to think about the distribution of differences, inclusion, and objections, and how this kind of way of thinking, which is meant, and PESA does talk about equality, is built upon notions of inequality by the very way it engages in a comparative notion. I did not talk about, but it was very interesting to me when I started to do it. I realized there's very little literature on the notion of what we mean by comparing. And if those of you who read the sort of the post and the new materialism, it's a very different notion of comparing than if you use sort of empiricism or positivism or what I call this sort of normative research that goes on. But even in PESA, there are different notions of comparing that go on at multiple levels. And it's this notion of comparing, which is, when I began thinking more about this, I realized that the formation of the modern sciences, social sciences, they are dealing with the pathological. Almost this, one of the things of struggling for the soul, I'll try to do this. When I was doing that, I realized that I studied urban schools and I studied rural schools. And you would think there was a difference, right? If I go to North Carolina in the middle of nowhere, those schools are going to be different than the middle of New York. Well, they are different in the sense of the geography and the sort of the pace of life is different. But think about teacher education. The teachers in all those schools have the same language. When they talk about the child who's not learning, it's the same language in Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn as it is in rural North Carolina. And you realize that and then when you go back and look at John Dewey, which is a folk hero, American folk hero, Dewey was very much involved in the settlement house. I don't know if you know about the settlement houses, but they had to do with the sort of the gentry going into the urban and urban areas with the immigrants and trying to understand how they lived to help their life. And you realize that George Herbert Mead, Dewey, the Chicago School, New York School, these major centers, at least in America, but this is also true in Britain, they were concerned with those who were not normal. They didn't use that word, but that was, and you realize that even today, much of social science still focuses on the other as a way of thinking about equality. And that has to be thought about a bit more. Okay, so to summarize, a lot of the social science we have has to do with phantasmagrams that are not about the present, but about some imagined future. That imagined future is not an imagined one of equality, but it's one which is built upon inequality that reproduces inequality. It also has in it its own notions of objection and exclusion and its notions of and efforts to try to include. And so I finish. If you have, the most important thing about this last slide is you have to look at the photograph of, we were biking in the Patagonia in Chile, but you have to look at which direction I was going, because it's the best way to go biking, downhill.
All right, thank you so much, Tom, for that wonderful, engaging and challenging lecture. Now we've got time for some few questions.
Thank you very much for that. And also thank you for bringing me up to date. Because I am reminded of a seminar at the University of Illinois about 1975, when the Swedish psychologist Torsten Hussein came through touting this new idea of PESA. He was absolutely slaughtered. The statistician said, "Your statistics are absolute rubbish." The comparative educators said, "You cannot do this. We in comparative education know that it is an impossible and misleading task." And Clarence Carrier, who you may remember, said, "This has only one useful purpose. It enables politicians to blame educators." You have provided me with a much more sophisticated account of just how that has transpired. Thank you very much for that.
Did you work with Bob Stake too?
Thank you, Thomas. I was struck by this the sense in which there's a scientism implicit in PESA, and the way in which, as a culture, it brings particular attempts to structure subjects in particular forms, both in a policy level, at a pedagogical level, and that one of the ways we might contest this is thinking about a different form of subject as in a different form of education.
You want me to answer that? I have two answers. The first answer is I don't want to answer it. And why? It seems to me, at least what I think of science, its best value is how to unthink so you can think. And so if what I said is all today, for example, helpful, it then becomes our obligation then to say, what are other ways to try to think? What are other alternatives? But I also worry about me doing that by myself. Jacques Rancière he has a book called The Hatred of Democracy. And I think if I think of me, is how do I provoke the unthinking? It's not that I'm afraid to think. And if you ask me, with all I said about John Dewey, if I had to send my kids and now my grandkids to school, I would go to the book about the Dewey School. To me, that's a beautiful book. But at the same moment, it requires a lot of rethinking. And how do you do that? And it seems to me that's a challenge. And it's the other sort of analogy I use is the Sisyphus. Okay, he did some nasty things, and I'm trying not to do them. But he was condemned, as those of you know the myth, he was condemned for life of rolling a stone up a hill but never getting to the top. And it seems to me that's the challenge. So I don't know if that adequately answers your question, or maybe, but that's the best I can do.
I've got time for one last question.
You're supposed to say it's time for coffee.
Okay, we'll go to coffee now. I suspect Dewey may have got some idea of what science was from Peirce, who was a scientist. But within PESA, there are other ways that we use it. I mean, we use it a great deal because we take the questions, which are very carefully constructed and tested and are quite, to actually use with our students. We're sort of looking at the effects of PESA from above, but do we have any kind of other ways that PESA is interacting with the education system that may be more productive or may have different results?
I have two different thinking about what you're asking. The first is, and that's, I think, where I started. PESA is a very good example of a particular way in which science acts. It's not just PESA. So PESA couldn't be, when I talked about its effective economy, PESA couldn't be made intelligible unless there was a whole other infrastructure around it, which is not just PESA. And so it's that larger one I really want to get to, even though I've been focusing on PESA here. The other part of answering or thinking about your question is what Ian Hacking calls the looping effect. What I've been thinking about is I use the term indigenous foreigner, and I don't know if Jim Ladwick is here. He's told me once I shouldn't use those words, but and traveling libraries. By indigenous foreign, I mean what PESA is someone who comes into different places and really doesn't belong there, but people think it does. And then it mixes with other things. And the traveling library is that PESA, this is maybe related to your question, there are other kinds of sort of cultural and social sort of ideas that are sort of also interacting that get connected and assembled with PESA, so it's just not PESA. And I think that's true in the US and probably true here. I know it's true in Sweden. And that's a different kind of question for me to answer, because then I have to really look at Australia or look at Sweden or the US to understand. And the best example I have of that, which doesn't mean, is I have before COVID, not with COVID, in China, and they talk about PESA with socialist values. Okay, and so and some people that I work with are writing about how PESA relates to those values, which is, in a sense, a reinterpretation. So there is that. You have to pay attention to it. But what's important to me is, in this Swedish project, we're talking about the agora. Agora is sort of the Greek marketplace. Okay, science enters into that marketplace as a space of action. It's not the only space of action. And so what I'm trying to do is say, what is going into that space of action we need to pay attention to. It's not the totality of it. And so your question is, how do we then understand the other things that begin to be assembled? But at the same moment, we have to pay attention to what's being brought in, which is where I'm. Coffee?
All right, thank you so much for that.